Right, I want to talk about gods tonight. The Tolkien kind specifically. The ones almost nobody, who's only seen the films, has ever actually heard named. I've been rereading bits of the Silmarillion this week, which I'll admit isn't a book most people get through on the first go. It reads a bit like scripture for the first 50 pages. Very powerful beings singing at each other. Nothing you'd call a plot yet. But underneath all of that sits the actual backstory to basically everything in the films and shows people actually watch. Gandalf, Essu Ron, the Balrog, even the eagles that show up whenever the story needs rescuing. All of it traces back to a group of beings called the Valar and the Maiar, and most people who've only seen the films have never heard that name once. So that's tonight. A slow walk through the gods of Middle-earth. Not gods in the temples and sacrifices sense, though a few people in the books do end up doing exactly that to Morgoth, much to the Valar's own discomfort. We'll get to why later. Think of them more as architects, the ones who built the world before anyone else turned up to actually live in it. We'll go through who they are, what they're each in charge of, why one of them turned into the original Dark Lord long before Esau-Ron was anyone's problem, and where wizards like Gandalf and S.H. Ruman actually come from, because it's a fair bit stranger than people assume. None of this needs remembering as you go. If you're properly asleep by the section about glowing trees, then it's done its job. There's a subscribe button somewhere on the screen if you end up liking this sort of thing, entirely up to you. Let's start at the very beginning, before there was a Middle-earth to even put gods in. Before any of this, there's just Eru, Ilúvatar, as he's called more often, which roughly translates to something like Father of all. He's the one god above everyone else in this mythology, the actual creator, and he barely appears again after these opening pages. That's a choice I find genuinely interesting. Most fantasy worlds keep their top god hovering somewhere in the background, occasionally weighing in. Tolkien mostly just lets him set things in motion and then steps back. What Eru does first is think other beings into existence. These are the Ainur, and they're not made the way anything else in this story gets made. No clay, no breath, nothing physical at all. Eru simply thinks of them, and they are, each one carrying a fragment of his mind that's entirely their own. They exist before the world does, before time does really. And what they do with that existence before anything we'd recognise as a story even starts is sing. This is the part of the Silmarillion that throws people off a bit, because it genuinely is just singing for several pages. Eru proposes a theme, the Ainur take it and elaborate on it, each one weaving in their own understanding, their own colour, like a choir where every single voice is also somehow a different instrument. And it's beautiful, by every account given, harmonious in a way that's hard to actually picture, which I think is sort of the point. Some things work better, left a bit abstract. Then one of them breaks it. Melkor, who at this point is the strongest and most gifted of all the Ainur, the one who'd wandered furthest into the empty places looking for things of his own to create, decides he wants the music to reflect his own ideas rather than Uru's. So he starts weaving in something discordant. Not just a wrong note, more like an entirely separate melody, trying to drag the whole performance toward what he wants it to be. And here's the bit I actually find more compelling than the betrayal itself. Eru doesn't stop him. He just responds, twice, weaving Melkor's discord back into something new. Something that wouldn't have existed without the disruption. The implication, and Tolkien is fairly explicit about this, is that no theme can be raised that doesn't ultimately find its source in Eru, including the bad ones. Even rebellion, in this cosmology, ends up serving a purpose its author never intended. That's a genuinely unusual move for a creation myth. Most of them want evil to come from somewhere clean and separate. This one just folds it back into the whole. After the music ends, Eru shows the Ainur a vision, the world as it could be, made real from everything they'd just sung into being. And then he gives them a choice. Some stay where they are, others choose to enter this new world called Eao and actually live inside the thing they helped imagine. The ones who go in are the ones we're spending the rest of tonight with. Since we're on the topic of that first crossing into the world, it's worth saying that what greeted the Aina when they arrived wasn't finished. Arda, this early version of the planet, was still raw, shapeless in places, nothing like the world a reader would later recognise from a map at the front of the book. So the Valar, which is the name given to the mightiest of these Ainu once they took up residence in the world, set about actually shaping it. Mountains, seas, the rough geography of everything. They built themselves a home in the middle of all this called Almarin, an island sitting on a great lake, roughly at the centre of the world. And to actually see what they were doing, since there was no sun yet, no moon, nothing, Aula, we'll properly meet him in a bit, he's the craftsman of the group, built 2 enormous lamps, Iluin in the north, Ormul in the south, each set on towering pillars, and between them the light pooled in the middle, right around Almarin, giving the Valar a kind of permanent golden afternoon to work in. Tolkien actually calls this period the Spring of Arda, which I rather like as a phrase. Melkor predictably hated this. He'd been off sulking in the dark since the music, and the sight of the other Valar quietly building something lovely without him seems to have tipped him fully into spite. He crept back, knocked down the pillars holding the lamps, and the resulting collapse didn't just put the lights out. It physically wrecked the symmetry of the early world, flooded parts of it, ruined Almarin entirely. The Valar had to abandon their first home outright, so they relocated, this time, to the far western continent of Aman, well away from wherever Melkor was currently lurking, and that's where they founded Val Nor, the realm most people picture when they hear the word at all. It's a defensive move, as much as anything. After losing one home to him already, they weren't keen on building somewhere he could simply wander back into. So that's where they end up, and before going through each of them individually, it's probably worth just laying out the basic shape of this group, since I don't want to be introducing names later with no context for where they fit. There are 14 Valar in total. They built themselves a golden city called Valimar, with their own halls scattered across the plain around it. And just outside the city, there's a council circle called Mahanaxar, the Ring of Doom, where they'd actually sit and debate the fate of the world together. Of those 14, 8 are considered the mightiest, a sort of inner circle called the Aratar, which just means something like the High Ones of Arda. That's Manwe, Varda, Ulmo, Yavanna, Auli, Mandos, Nienna and Orome, and we'll spend proper time with each of them tonight. One detail I genuinely love, and it's the kind of thing that only really shows up if you read the actual book rather than a summary, is that none of their real names are recorded anywhere. Manwe, Varda, all of it. These are titles, descriptions of role and character, not the private names the Valar might use among themselves. It's a small thing, but it does something clever. It keeps even the reader at arm's length from them. You're never meant to feel like you fully know these beings the way you know a character like Frodo. There's always a bit of distance. Of that group, 12 are paired off into 6 married couples, while 2 of them, Ulmo and Nienna, dwell on their own. And it's worth saying plainly, since the books are fairly direct about it themselves, that men in Middle-earth do sometimes end up worshipping the Valar as gods, with names and shrines and all the rest of it, even though that's not really the relationship Eru or the Valar intended. They're meant to be stewards, not objects of devotion. People revere them anyway. People do that. Right, with the furniture in place, let's actually meet them. Eagles. That's honestly where I'd start with Manwe, because it's the detail that actually survives into the parts of the legendarium most people have read. Whenever a giant eagle shows up in the films to pluck someone off a cliff at the last possible moment, that's not a random bit of fantasy convenience. That's Manwe's people. He's the Lord of the Eagles, and they bring him news of everything happening across the world, since he himself stays mostly up on his mountain. That mountain is Tarnikatil, the tallest peak in all of Arda, and it's where Manwe makes his home with his wife Varda, looking out over basically everything. He's also called Sulimo, which ties him to wind and air, and the general breadth of the world. So storms, the sky, weather, all of that falls under him as well. Of all the Valar, he's the one Eru is said to understand most clearly, the one closest to the original purpose behind it all. And he's the acknowledged king of the Valar as a result, the one who calls the councils and generally leads. Here's a strange detail that I think gets glossed over a lot. In the thought of Ilúvatar, before any of the falling out happened, Manwë and Melkor were considered brothers. Same origin, same closeness to Eru's own mind, just pointed in completely different directions once given the chance to choose. I find that more unsettling than dramatic, honestly. It's not good versus evil from two unrelated sources, it's two halves of something that started in the same place and split. And that closeness is exactly why Manwë's story gets complicated later on. Because after everything Melkor does, the lamps, the lies, all of it, it's Manwë who eventually decides to pardon him and let him back into Val-IH, nor under a kind of supervised freedom. We'll get properly into that decision later, because it's a genuinely costly piece of misplaced mercy, but I wanted to plant it here. Manwë isn't written as a flawless king. He's written as someone whose best quality, this instinct to forgive and trust, ends up being exploited by the one person who absolutely shouldn't have been trusted again. Varda is the one I'd argue actually outlasts every other Valar in terms of how Middle-earth remembers her. Long after the events of the Silmarillion are ancient history to everyone still alive in the Third Age. She's Manwë's wife, the greatest of the female Valar, and her particular gift is light, specifically the stars. Before anything else existed to light the sky, Varda took the light of the stars she had kindled after the destruction of Iluin and Ormel, and used it to brighten the original stars, the ones the earliest elves would wake up under at Cuiviénen. Later, once the two trees are growing in Val-Ignor, which we'll get to properly in a bit, she gathers their light as well, and uses it to make the brighter, newer stars and constellations that show up later in the story. So in a sense, every bit of starlight across this entire mythology runs back through her hands at some point. One of those constellations is worth a quick mention since it's not just decoration. She sets a particular shape of stars in the northern sky called the Sickle of the Valar, specifically as a kind of standing threat, hung there, facing down toward wherever Melkor happens to be lurking at the time. A permanent sign that his eventual downfall is already accounted for, whether he likes it or not. I think that's a properly lovely way to handle a warning. Just leave it burning quietly overhead for anyone to look up and notice. No urgency to it at all. What I find genuinely touching about her is the detail explaining why Melkor specifically hates and fears her more than all others whom Eru made. It's not really about power. It's that she's the one who saw exactly what he was before the music had even properly begun, and rejected him outright with no ambiguity about it, long before he'd done anything to actually earn that judgment. There's something quite uncomfortable in that if you sit with it. She wasn't wrong about him, but she also made up her mind before he'd had the chance to be anything other than what she already assumed he'd become. Among the elves, especially much later on, she's called by her Sindarin name, Elbereth, and she becomes something close to a genuine object of reverence, invoked in moments of real fear or darkness. It's not something I'm going to get into the specifics of tonight, partly because that's a whole rabbit hole on its own involving elvish hymn traditions. But it's worth knowing that out of this whole powerful, ancient pantheon, it's the Queen of the Stars whose name actually survives furthest into the story everyone's already read. Since we've just been talking about a married pair, let's go somewhere a bit different, because Ulmo is one of only two Valar who doesn't actually live in Valley nor with everyone else. He's the Lord of Waters, in charge of every sea, lake and river across the whole of Arda, and rather than taking a hall in Valimar like the rest of them, he chooses to live out in the deep ocean itself, only really coming back to Val-Ich Nor for the big councils when something genuinely important needs deciding. There's something I quite like about that choice. He's one of the most powerful beings in the entire mythology, and he picks the loneliest possible address for himself. Before any of this, back during the music itself, Ulmo was one of the Ainur who took part in the great music, and that affection seems to have carried straight through into his domain, because the sound of water, waves, rain, all of it is described as a kind of leftover echo of that original song. Which is a nice idea, honestly, the sea as a sort of standing memory of how the whole universe got started. The other thing that sets him apart is that he's far more willing than most of the other Valar to act directly in the world, rather than simply observing from a distance. There's a recurring pattern across the Legendarium where Ulmo personally shows up, often through dreams or visions sent along rivers, to nudge particular people toward decisions that matter. He's the one behind Tuor's guided journey to the hidden elvish city of Gondolin, for instance, sending guidance to a mortal man that eventually leads him there. The other Valar tend to hold back and let events play out. Ulmo just doesn't really. Not when he thinks it matters enough. It's not just the founding either. Long before that, it's also Ulmo who appears to the city's king Turgon, urging him to keep Gondolin hidden and well guarded no matter how settled and safe things might start to feel, a warning Turgon mostly heeds for centuries, and then, fatally, stops heeding right when it counts. I rather like that Ulmo's the one Valar who keeps quietly intervening across generations, rather than just once, almost as if he never fully bought into the idea that staying out of it was actually the responsible move. Right, now for one of my favourites, partly because his story has an actual proper mistake in it, which is rarer than you'd think among beings this powerful. Aula is the smith of the Valar, the one concerned with the physical substance of the world itself, stone, metal, the actual matter everything is built from. He made both of the great lamps that lit the world before the sun and moon existed, and later the Valar prepare the vessels that carry the sun and moon themselves across the sky, with Varda providing the light that fills them. But the thing all is best remembered for is the dwarves, and the story behind them is genuinely a bit chaotic. He loved teaching, loved having students to pass his crafts on to, and the elves hadn't woken up yet, wouldn't for ages yet actually. So out of pure impatience, he secretly built an entire race of beings himself, deep underground, hoping to have someone to teach in the meantime, which when you say it like that, is a fairly enormous overreach for someone who's meant to be a steward of the world rather than its rival creator. Eru finds out, obviously, because Eru finds out about everything and confronts him directly. Aula's response is the bit that gets me. He doesn't argue or justify himself, he just picks up a hammer and prepares to destroy what he'd made, genuinely ready to undo his own creation rather than defy Ilúvatar. And it's that humility, that immediate willingness to give it up, that changes Eru's mind. He grants the dwarves true life of their own, on the condition they sleep underground until after the actual elves have woken, since Eru wanted his own children to come first. Auli gets to keep them. The dwarves, to this day in the stories, call him Mahal and treat him as their actual maker, which he is. There's a small lovely bit of follow-through to that story too. The dwarves themselves have their own tradition, separate from anything the elves believe, that when they die, they don't simply vanish from the world the way the rest of the children of Ilúvatar eventually do. They believe Mahal gathers them back to himself, sets them apart somewhere, and that at the very end of all things, he'll use them to help rebuild whatever's broken by then. A maker's creations, in their own telling, eventually helping the maker finish the job properly. It's worth saying, since it comes up properly later tonight, that both SOW Ron and SAH Ruman start out as devoted students under Aule before everything goes wrong for them. Whatever else you think of him, he's clearly someone who attracts talent, just not always the right kind. Aule's wife is Yavanna, and if his domain is rock and metal, hers is everything that grows out of it, every tree, every root, every blade of grass across all of Arda. Her name actually translates to something like giver of fruits, and she's usually pictured as a tall woman dressed entirely in green, which, fair enough, does the job. People sometimes point out how odd the pairing is, the smith and the gardener, industry married to growth, and I think that's actually rather the point of it. They balance each other in a fairly literal sense, since one of them is constantly worried the other's work is going to end up destroying hers, and that worry becomes a real plot point eventually. Yavanna grows anxious, much later in the story, about what's going to happen to her forests once other creatures, particularly the more industrious ones, start spreading across Middle-earth. She raises the concern with Manwë directly, who seeks the will of Eru, and the result is the Ents, those slow ancient tree shepherds who exist chiefly to look after the forests in case nobody else will. I rather love that detail. An entire species exists in this mythology because one goddess got nervous about deforestation before deforestation was even a problem yet. Her biggest individual achievement, though, comes later, after Melkor's first major act of destruction against the Valar. Once the original 2 lamps are gone, and Valar Nor needs a new source of light, it's Yavanna who sings the 2 trees into being, and that's genuinely worth its own section, so let's go there now. So after the original lamps fall and the Valar resettle in Aman, Valar Nor needs its own light, and Yavanna provides it by singing 2 trees into existence on a green mound outside the gates of Valimar. Telperion, older of the 2, with silver leaves and a soft white glow, and Laurelin beside him, younger, gold, warmer in colour. Nienna, who we'll properly meet shortly, is said to have wept over the mound before the trees ever rose, her tears part of whatever it took for them to actually take root, which I think is a lovely, slightly sad little detail to leave sitting in the background of an otherwise quite hopeful story. The 2 trees didn't just sit there glowing constantly. Each one waxed and waned on its own private rhythm, one brightening as the other dimmed, the cycles overlapping just briefly at certain points, so the light blended together into something neither tree could quite produce alone. That rhythm of waxing and waning of the 2 trees is what effectively gave Valar Nor its sense of recurring light and shadow, long before there was a sun or moon doing that job anywhere else. People sometimes call this whole stretch the noontide of Valar Nor, the high point, the golden age before anything had properly gone wrong yet. It's the part of the mythology I find easiest to actually picture peacefully. 2 trees breathing light at each other in turns, an entire civilization living by their rhythm. It's worth just sitting in that for a moment, rather than rushing toward what eventually happens to them, because what eventually happens to them is its own proper section later on, and I'd rather you hold on to the lovely version of the 2 trees for now, before we get there. Right, from trees to something a bit heavier, though honestly not as grim as the title makes it sound. Mandos, whose actual name is Narmo, though almost nobody calls him that, is the doomsman of the Valar. And doom in this context doesn't mean punishment the way it does in everyday English. It's closer to fate, or judgment, the shape a thing is destined to take. He's the keeper of the houses of the dead, where the spirits of slain elves go to wait, sometimes for a very long time, before whatever comes next for them. Men, interestingly, do go to Mandos, but they don't remain there. Their fate takes them somewhere entirely outside the world, a gift the elves never quite understand, and occasionally even envy, which I think is a properly clever inversion of how most mythologies treat mortality. His wife is Vaira, called the Weaver, and her job is genuinely one of my favourite ideas in the whole of Tolkien's cosmology. She weaves everything that has ever happened, every event across the whole history of Arda, into vast tapestries that line the walls of Mandos's halls, and as more history happens, the halls themselves simply grow to make room for it. So in a very literal sense, the entire past is just hanging on the walls somewhere, being added to constantly, by someone whose whole existence is dedicated to making sure none of it gets forgotten. she's not entirely alone in that work either. There's a quiet, almost domestic detail involving Fëanor's mother, Muriel, who dies, in a manner of speaking, shortly after giving birth to him, her spirit drifting off to Mandos out of sheer exhaustion rather than any violence. Rather than simply waiting there indefinitely, the way most spirits do, she is re-embodied in Mandos, and is said in later commentary to join Vaira in weaving the history of her own people, though this remains an interpretive extension rather than a direct canonical claim. A small, fairly tender thing to do with what's essentially an afterlife. And since we're already deep into the quieter end of the pantheon, let's stay there for a bit, because this next pair might be the gentlest two Valar in the entire set, purely because their whole domain is rest. Urmo, almost always called Lorien after the place he lives, rather than by his actual name, is the master of visions and dreams. His gardens, also called Lorien, are described as the most beautiful place in the entire world, somewhere even the other Valar go when they need a break from the general business of running everything. Within those gardens, on a small island in a lake called Lorellan, his wife, Easter, sleeps through the day, grey-robed, gentle, and her gift, quite simply, is rest. Anyone exhausted, weary, worn down by the weight of being immortal and responsible for an entire world, ends up at her fountains eventually. Here's a small detail I genuinely enjoy. Before he ever goes anywhere near Middle-earth, the Maya who will eventually become Gandalf spends a great deal of time in these gardens, as he is a Maya of Urmo. We'll talk about him properly later, once we get to the Maya as a whole. But I like planting that here, because it means the character so many people picture as a grumpy old man with a staff actually started his existence somewhere that is, by design, the single most restful place in the entire mythology. Feels appropriate for tonight's video, if nothing else. Nienna is the sister of both Mandos and Lorien, which makes the three of them a sort of family unit dedicated entirely to death, dreams, and grief, which is either a slightly odd household arrangement or exactly the right combination, depending on your perspective. She lives alone, away from the others, on the western edges of the world, and her whole domain is mourning. Whatever pain has been done to Arda over its long history, by Melkor especially, she's said to feel it more sharply than any other Valar. But she's not written as someone who simply despairs. The actual line of thinking behind her character is that grief, properly sat with, produces pity and endurance. The ability to keep going, rather than be crushed by what's happened. She frequents the halls of Mandos often, and there's a suggestion that her presence there is part of what helps the dead actually process whatever brought them to those halls in the first place. And here's the detail I think matters most, even though it's a quiet one. Among her pupils, at some point, is the same Maya we just mentioned, Olorin, the one who'll eventually become Gandalf. From her, he learns pity and patience, specifically, which becomes genuinely important much later, in a story most of you already know, because it's that exact quality learned from a goddess of grief on the far edge of a world most people in that later story have never heard of, that ends up shaping how Gandalf treats a creature called Gollum. Mercy he extends, mercy Frodo eventually copies, mercy that turns out to matter rather a lot by the end of that whole saga. Funny how these things trace back. Right, let's pick the pace up slightly, because Orome is considerably less melancholy than the last few entries. He's the huntsman of the Valar, and unlike most of the others, who tend to stay fairly close to Valinor, Orome spent a great deal of time riding out across the dark, unfinished lands of early Middle-earth on his horse, Nahar, hunting down the monstrous things Melkor had been breeding in the shadows. He carries a great horn, and the sound of it alone is said to have terrified Melkor's creatures more than almost anything else in the world, which is a fairly good party trick if you can manage it. The properly important thing he does, though, happens almost by accident. During one of these long rides through the dark, he's the very first of the Valar to come across the newly awoken elves at a lake called Cuivienen, the actual moment in this mythology where the children of Ilúvatar first appear in the world. It's Oromi's discovery that eventually leads the Valar to invite the elves west to Val I Nor Atoll, which sets off basically the entire rest of the Silmarillion. Quite a lot riding on one bloke being out hunting at the right time. His wife is Varna, the ever-young younger sister of Yavanna, and her gift is considerably gentler than his. Flowers bloom wherever she walks, and birds are said to sing the moment she arrives anywhere. It's also worth mentioning that a particular Maya named Melian served Varna for a long while before deciding to leave Valinor entirely and head out into Middle-earth on her own, which turns into one of the loveliest side stories in the whole mythology. And to round off this stretch of introductions, here's the pair I'd argue are the most straightforwardly fun of the whole group. Tulkas was the very last of the Valar to actually arrive in Arda, and he turns up exactly when he's needed, during the early conflict with Melkor, bringing nothing but his own physical strength to the fight. No weapon, no mount, none of the usual trappings of power the other Valar carry around. He's described with golden hair, a ruddy complexion, and an apparently permanent good mood, someone who genuinely delights in wrestling and contests of strength, the way other people delight in a nice cup of tea. He's also, brilliantly, the only being in the entire mythology said to be brave enough, or possibly just oblivious enough, to laugh in Melkor's actual face, in the middle of a fight no less. It's Tulkas' strength that finally pins Melkor down, during that later great confrontation, after Melkor's lamp-smashing rampage, and this is what leads to his eventual imprisonment. His wife Nessa is Oromis' sister, light on her feet, genuinely faster than the deer that follow her everywhere she goes, and famous across Val I Nor for her dancing on the lawns outside Valimar. Compared to most of the other Valar, who carry around centuries of grief or cosmic responsibility, Tulkas and Nessa come across as the two who are simply, uncomplicatedly enjoying being alive, which I think every pantheon probably needs at least one pair of. Right, time to actually sit properly with Melkor, since we've been circling him all night without quite landing on him directly. He was, by every account, the most powerful of all the Ainur, even before anything had gone wrong. Stronger than Manwë, more knowledgeable in some respects than any of the others, the one who'd wandered furthest out into the empty places looking for things to create that were entirely his own. That's actually the root of the whole problem, if you think about it. It wasn't that he lacked anything the others had. He had more than most of them. What he wanted was for it to be his, specifically, rather than something he shared credit for. We already talked about how that played out during the music itself, the discord he wove into it, and how Eru simply absorbed that discord back into the wider theme, rather than rejecting it outright. We also covered the lamps, a major act of destruction, once the Valar had actually settled into the world, smashing the pillars and wrecking their first home at Almarin entirely. What I want to fill in now is everything that happened around and after that. After the destruction of the lamps, there was a great confrontation, generally called the Battle of the Powers, where the rest of the Valar, now long established in the world themselves, realised what Melkor was actually trying to do, which was simply claim the whole of Arda as his personal domain, no sharing involved. They fought him for it, and it's Tulkas, arriving last and throwing himself directly into the fight, who finally manages to overpower him. Melkor's defeated, bound, and locked away in the halls of Mandos. And here's where it gets properly uncomfortable, because he doesn't stay locked away forever. After what's described as 3 full ages of imprisonment, genuinely long stretches of time by any measure, Manwë, his own brother in the thought of Ilúvatar, grants Melkor pardon when his prayer for release is finally granted. He's released, technically, under watch, allowed back into Val I Nor itself, I think this is one of the more quietly devastating decisions in the whole mythology, and it's worth sitting with, rather than rushing past. Manwë isn't being foolish exactly, he's being generous, in a way that makes complete sense given who he is, the most trusting and least suspicious of all, the Valar. But generosity aimed at someone who has already shown you exactly what he's capable of isn't really wisdom. It's just hope dressed up as judgment. And Melkor, predictably, uses every bit of that freedom to start quietly rebuilding his influence from the inside. He spends years pretending humility, working his way back into favour, all the while sowing small lies among the elves who'd settled in Valar by then, planting suspicion between families, encouraging pride and rivalry where there hadn't been any before. All of that quiet groundwork is leading somewhere specific, and where it leads is the worst single act of destruction in the whole of this mythology, which deserves its own proper section rather than being squeezed in at the end of this one. So let's take a short breath here and go there next. So after years of pretending reform, Melkor finally makes his move, and he doesn't do it alone. Out in a region called Avathar, a narrow strip of land kept in permanent shadow on the southern edge of Amman, there lives a being called Ungoliant, who may not be listed among the Ainur, not really part of this same system of gods. Just an ancient, ravenous darkness that's taken the shape of a monstrous spider and lives purely to consume light, any light, endlessly, never satisfied. Melkor finds her and strikes a deal. Help me, and you can feast on more light than you've ever imagined. Together they travel to the green mound where the two trees stand, and while Ungoliant wraps the place in an unnatural, smothering darkness, blacker than ordinary night, Melkor wounds both trees directly, and Ungoliant drains what's left, draining every last bit of sap and light out of them until there's nothing left to give. The trees, source of everything Val Ijnor had been built around, simply die. The grief that follows is somewhat hard to overstate, but I'd rather not dwell in misery over it for too long, since that's not really what tonight's about. The short version is that the Valar try desperately to find a way to heal the trees, and the one thing that might work involves Feanor, a brilliant and famously stubborn elf who'd crafted 3 jewels called the Silmarils, capturing some of the tree's original light inside them. He's asked to give that light back. He refuses, and later, the jewels are stolen by Melkor anyway, who flees Valinor entirely, taking them with him. It's around this point that he properly earns the name most people actually know him by, Morgoth. What's left of the trees, in the end, is one final fruit from Laurelin and one final flower from Telperion, and Yavanna and Nienna work together to preserve them, sailing them through the sky as the sun and moon. They're guided by 2 Maiar, Arien steering the sun, a being so thoroughly made of fire that even Melkor's corruption can't touch her, and Tilion steering the moon, a quieter spirit who'd grown fond of Telperion's old silver light and was chosen for the job. Tilion's a bit of a wanderer in his course, by the way, occasionally drifting close enough to Arian's light that the two nearly collide, which is the actual mythological explanation in this universe for why eclipses happen at all. Bit of a lovely, slightly clumsy detail to end a fairly sad chapter on. Right, now that the sun and moon are up and running, let's talk properly about the Maiar, since we've been name-dropping a few of them all night, without ever stopping to explain what they actually are. Maiar are basically the same kind of being as the Valar, Ainur, who chose to enter the world, just of a lesser order, less powerful individually, and there are quite a lot more of them, most never even named in the actual books. Each one tends to attach themselves to a particular Valar, whose general temperament or interests match their own, serving them, learning from them, occasionally just keeping them company. Manwë's herald is Eönwë, who carries his banner and is considered the single greatest warrior among all the Maiar, though we won't get properly into what that means until a bit later, since his big moment is still a couple of sections away. Varda has a handmaid called Ilmara, about whom very little is actually written, which I rather like, Not every figure in a mythology needs a full backstory. Some just exist quietly in the margins. Ulmo, being Lord of Waters, has Osa and Uinen serving him, a married pair themselves, with Osa being the wilder of the two, drawn to storms and rough coastal seas, while Uinen calms things back down again, which sailors across the whole of Middle-earth apparently learn to pray to fairly early on. We already met Arian and Tilion properly just now, guiding the sun and moon, so I won't repeat all that. Just a quick nod, since they're Maya themselves and belong in this list. The one I actually want to spend real time on is Melian, because her story is, genuinely, one of my favourites in the whole of Tolkien's writing, and it barely involves the Valar at all once it gets going. She'd served Varna for a long while in Valley Nor, the one we mentioned earlier, tending flowers and sweetening things generally, but at some point she simply leaves, crosses over into Middle-earth on her own, and ends up wandering a forest called Nan Elmuth, where she spends her time singing among the nightingales, more or less just enjoying her own company. Then an elf called Thingol, travelling with his people on the great journey, hears that singing and goes to investigate, and the moment he actually sees her, he simply stops, stands there entranced, unable to move or speak, for what he experiences as barely any time at all. Except it isn't barely any time at all. While the two of them stand there gazing at each other, completely lost, years pass in the outside world. Real years. His own people search for him for ages, eventually giving up, scattering, some of them founding new settlements elsewhere entirely because their king has simply vanished. And eventually, Thingol and Melian come back to themselves, married, and together found the hidden forest kingdom of Doriath, which becomes one of the most important elvish realms in the whole of the First Age. I find that story genuinely moving rather than just charming, because it's not really framed as romantic in the breezy sense. It's framed as something closer to being struck by lightning, an encounter so far outside the ordinary scale of things that it costs the people around them years of their actual lives without either of them noticing. Once they're married, Melian does something no other Maya in the entire legendarium is explicitly described as weaving an actual barrier of protective enchantment around the whole of Doriath, an invisible wall of shadow and confusion that keeps anything hostile from simply wandering in. It's called the Girdle of Melian, and for the better part of an entire age, it makes Doriath the single safest place in all of Middle-earth, largely unscathed while everything around it burns. Melian and Thingol eventually have a daughter together too, called Luthien, whose own story is, frankly, one of the great love stories in the entire mythology, properly equal parts beautiful and devastating, and it deserves a whole night of its own, rather than a few rushed lines tacked onto the end of this one, so I'll leave her there for now, as something to maybe come back to another time. Now for the less pleasant Maya, because not all of them stayed loyal, and the most famous example, by a fairly wide margin, is one we've already mentioned in passing tonight. Sauron, whose original name was Myron, started out as one of Aule's students, same as S.H. Ruman would later on. Gifted, skilled, genuinely talented at making things. What drew him toward Melkor, from what's written about him, wasn't cruelty for its own sake, not at first anyway. It was more a fascination with order, with control, with the idea that things could be arranged efficiently if someone simply had enough authority to arrange them. Melkor corrupted him and gave him great authority, and Myron accepted it, eventually becoming his chief lieutenant, the one largely responsible for carrying out his will, while Morgoth himself sat in his fortress brooding over his own grievances. The Balrogs are a different sort of corruption, entirely. Originally, Maya of fire and shadow, who Melkor twisted into something closer to walking weapons than actual spirits, demons wreathed in flame, carrying whips and blades, terrifying enough that even other powerful beings tend to avoid them where possible. Their leader, during the Wars of the First Age, is one called Gothmog, considered the single most dangerous of Morgoth's commanders. And yes, before anyone wonders, the Balrog that Giandalf eventually fights in the mines of Emor, the one most people actually know from the films, comes from exactly this same stock. One of the last of these fire demons left lurking deep underground, long after the rest of Morgoth's forces had been scattered. I don't want to spend too much longer in this particular section, partly because it's the one part of tonight that edges toward genuinely frightening rather than just old and strange. And that's not really the mood I'm going for. Just worth knowing it's there in the background, the dark mirror of everything we've spent the rest of the night admiring. For a very long stretch of the First Age, after everything we've just covered, the Valar largely stay out of it. Morgoth wages war against the elves and the small number of men allied with them across an entire region called Beleriand for centuries, and the Valar, despite clearly having the power to intervene, mostly choose not to. There's a real philosophy behind that restraint, something close to respecting the right of the children of Ilúvatar to live out their own struggles, rather than having every problem solved for them by beings infinitely stronger than they are. Whether that's wisdom or just a fairly convenient excuse for distance is something readers have been arguing about for decades, and I don't think there's a clean answer either way. What finally changes their minds is a single act of desperate diplomacy. A half-elven mariner called Eärendil, carrying one of the recovered Silmarils on his brow, sails all the way to Val-e-Nor itself and pleads on behalf of both elves and men, asking the Valar to finally act. And they do. Eönwë, Manwë's herald, the one we mentioned earlier as the best with weapons in all Arda among the Maiar, leads an enormous combined host of Valar and Maiar back into Middle-earth. And the resulting conflict, called the War of Wrath, is so violent it physically reshapes the lands of Beleriand and the surrounding regions. Most of Beleriand simply sinks beneath the sea by the end of it, an entire landmass effectively erased from the map. It's Eärendil himself, still sailing his ship through the upper air by this point, who ends up dealing with the single, most dramatic moment of the whole war, facing down Morgoth's greatest dragon, Ancalagon, said to be the largest winged dragon ever to exist in the entire legendarium. Eärendil kills him, and Ancalagon falls from such a height with such weight that his body simply crushes the towers of Morgoth's own fortress on impact. Not the most dignified end for a fortress that had stood for the better part of an age, brought down by its own dead dragon landing on it. Morgoth himself is finally defeated, bound in chains, and cast out through something called the Door of Night, into the empty void beyond the world entirely, with only a quiet, unresolved warning hanging over the whole story that he might, somehow, return at the very end of days. Tolkien never fully nailed that idea down across his writings, so I won't pretend it's settled lore, just a loose thread he left hanging. One last lovely detail before we move on. After the war, Eönwë takes custody of the surviving Silmarils and the surviving sons of Feanor, the ones responsible for some genuinely horrific choices across the whole story, sneak into his camp and steal those Silmarils. And rather than simply destroying them, which he absolutely could have done, he shows them mercy, lets them go. Considering how much of tonight has been about beings who don't always make the wisest call with the power they're handed, it's nice to end this particular stretch on someone who did. Right, this next bit is one of the strangest stretches of the whole legendarium, partly because it's one of the few places in the entire mythology where Eru himself, the actual top god we started the night with, steps back in and does something directly. So let's take our time with it. After the War of Wrath wraps everything up, the Valar want to reward the men who'd fought alongside the elves against Morgoth, the Edain as they're called. So they raise an entire island out of the sea for them, somewhere between Middle-earth and Val-e-Nor itself, called Hnu-o-Men-or, gorgeous place by every account, longer-lived people than ordinary men, genuinely closer to the Valar than any other mortal nation ever gets to be. There's one condition attached though. usually called the Ban of the Valar. The Númenóreans are allowed to sail almost anywhere in the world they like, except west, toward Vaal-y-Hicnor itself. The fear, reasonably enough, is that if mortal men start visiting the Undying Lands regularly, they'll start wanting the immortality that comes with living there, and immortality was never meant to be theirs. For a good while, this works fine. The Númenóreans build an extraordinary civilization, sailing further than anyone else in the world, genuinely thriving. But envy is a slow thing, and over generations it builds. Even with lifespans several times longer than anyone else's, the Númenóreans start resenting the one thing they're explicitly told they can't have. Watching ships sail west toward Valinor and wondering more and more bitterly why the line has to be drawn exactly there. That resentment settles eventually on the last king of no men, or a man called Ar-Pharazôn, proud even by the standards of a nation that had been growing proud for centuries. And this is where Esau-Ron properly re-enters the story, because by this point, Esau-Ron has been quietly rebuilding power back in Middle-earth, and Ar-Pharazôn, rather than tolerating a rival, sails out with an overwhelming fleet and demands Esau-Ron's surrender. Sauron somewhat unexpectedly agrees and lets himself be taken back to Nomen, or as a sort of captive, which turns out to be exactly the move he wanted. Once inside the palace, Esau-Ron spends years quietly working his way into the king's confidence, the same playbook more or less that Melkor ran on the elves of Valinor centuries earlier, just aimed at men this time. He convinces Ar-Pharazôn that the Valar have been lying all along, that immortality is simply being withheld out of jealousy rather than genuine concern, and he gets a temple built to worship Melkor right there on the island, with increasingly dark rites attached to it. It's a genuinely uncomfortable stretch of the story, watching an entire civilization talk itself into believing the thing that's actually destroying it. Eventually, old and afraid of his own death despite everything, Ar-Pharazôn does the one thing none of his ancestors had ever quite brought themselves to do. He builds the largest fleet Middle-earth has ever seen and sails it directly west toward Valinor, intending to take immortality from the Valar by force if they won't simply hand it over. It's a fairly remarkable piece of arrogance, even by the standards of everything else we've covered tonight. And it's also the point in this mythology where the Valar quietly admit they can't handle something on their own. They lay down much of their guardianship of the world and appeal straight to Eru. And Eru responds, plainly, in the only moment across this whole night where he does. The world is changed. Arda, which had been flat up to this point, is bent into a sphere, and Valinor, along with the rest of Armen, is taken entirely out of what's called the circles of the world, removed from ordinary physical reach forever. Ar-Pharazôn's fleet is simply swallowed into the abyss, and the island of En-Omen, or itself, sinks beneath the sea, gone in what's described as a great cataclysm of waves. A small number of the faithful, those Númenóreans who'd never bought into Esau-Ron's lies, escape beforehand, led by a man called Elendil, and they sail back to Middle-earth, where they go on to found the kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor, with Elendil founding Arna and his sons founding Gondor, the very kingdoms still standing, still mattering by the time anyone's reading about a hobbit carrying a ring centuries later. So if you've ever wondered why Aragorn's claim to the throne of Gondor actually means anything, why that bloodline carries the weight it does in the story most people already know, this is where it starts. And there's one last lovely, slightly mournful detail worth knowing. For the world's ordinary inhabitants now, the only way to reach Vaal-i-Nor at all is by sailing around the curve of a round planet, which simply leads you back to where you started. Since Vaal-i-Nor is no longer part of the mortal world in the way it used to be, but there's said to be a straight road still. An old path that doesn't follow the curve of the world the way every other route now has to, and only a few are ever permitted to find it, mostly elves, sailing west at the very end of their time in Middle-earth, vanishing off the edge of an ordinary map into somewhere the rest of the world genuinely can't follow anymore. Right, this is the bit I've been looking forward to all night, if I'm honest, because it answers a question I think a lot of people watching have probably wondered about at some point, without ever quite chasing down the answer. Where does Gandalf actually come from? Why does he show up an old man with a staff wandering around for centuries, never explaining himself properly to anyone? The answer runs straight back through everything we've covered tonight. By the early Third Age, roughly 1,000 years in, Manwë starts hearing reports that SOW Ron, defeated but never destroyed at the end of the Second Age, is quietly stirring again, somewhere in the south of Middle-earth. So he calls a council of the Valar to decide what, if anything, ought to be done about it. And this time, rather than marching an army the way they did with the War of Wrath, they decide on something far more restrained. A handful of Maiar sent in disguise as old men to walk among the free peoples and simply help, through wisdom and persuasion rather than open power. Two volunteer almost immediately. Curumo, who we already know as one of Aulë's most devoted students, the same one who will eventually become Rhuman, and a Maiar of Oromi's people called LOTR. Manwë then replies that he wishes a third to go, a quiet Maiar called Olorin, the same one we've mentioned twice tonight already, the one who learned dreams and visions in Lorien and pity from Nienna, and Olorin, in a moment I genuinely love, says no, or close to it, says he isn't strong enough for the task, says he's actually afraid of SOW Ron. Manwë's response is essentially that this is exactly why he should go, that fear of the right things is a kind of wisdom the other two volunteers might be lacking. And it's Varda, listening to all this, who insists he shouldn't be sent as some lesser third choice at all, elevating him properly alongside the other two from the very start. Yavanna, not wanting her own people left out of this, asks Curumo to bring along another Maiar of hers, a gentle soul called Iwendil, who loves animals and growing things more than almost anything else. And LOTR brings a friend of his own too, called Palando. 5 in total then. Curumo becomes Rhuman, robed in white, named Chief of the Order. Olorin becomes Gandalf, robed in grey, generally considered the wisest even though he's nominally the most junior. Iwendil becomes Arad Hergast, robed in brown, who mostly disappears into the wilderness to look after animals and barely features in the wider story at all. And LOTR and Palando become the so-called Blue Wizards, who head east almost immediately and are never properly heard from again in any of Tolkien's finished writing. There's a stray comment in one of his letters suggesting they might have ended up founding secret resistance movements, or possibly the opposite, magic cults, among peoples living under SOW Ron's influence further east. But it's just a passing thought he never developed any further. I quite like that it's left that vague, honestly. Not everything needs an ending. There's one restriction placed on the Astari that I think explains an enormous amount about how Gandalf actually behaves throughout The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. They're explicitly forbidden from ruling anyone by force or from matching SOW Ron's raw power with power of their own. Their entire job is to inspire, to guide, to occasionally show up at exactly the right moment with exactly the right piece of advice, never to simply solve everything by being stronger than the problem. Which is precisely why Gandalf spends so much of his story nudging people rather than fighting battles single-handedly, why he relies on hobbits and rangers and a fairly reluctant fellowship rather than just sorting SOW Ron out himself the moment he turns up. It's not a limitation the films always make obvious, it's baked directly into why he was sent at all. Rhuman, of course, eventually breaks that restriction entirely, which most of you watching probably already know the broad shape of even without the Valar context, seduced by his own cleverness and eventually by SOW Ron's voice, in a stolen seeing stone, ending up trying to rule Middle-earth by exactly the kind of force he was sent there to prevent. It's a genuinely sad story when you trace it all the way back to its starting point. A gifted, eager Maiar who simply wanted to prove himself the most capable of the 5, ending up the only one who fully abandons what he was actually sent there to do. And it's worth pausing on this because it's the last time, across the entire night, that the Valar act directly in events that overlap with the story most people watching this have already read or watched in some form. After this, they recede properly into the background, present mostly as something felt rather than seen, which brings us nicely toward where I want to spend the rest of tonight. So here's something I find genuinely interesting once you've sat through everything else tonight, which is how much of this cosmology is still quietly humming away in the background of The Lord of the Rings, even though, after no men or sinks, the Valar formally step back from direct involvement in the world. They don't vanish, they just stop showing up in person. Take the eagles. We talked about them right at the start, Manwë's birds, bringing him news of the world from up on Taniqatil. And if you've read The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings, or even just watched the films, you'll know exactly the pattern I mean, because eagles turn up at suspiciously convenient moments more than once. They rescue Thorin's company from trees surrounded by wolves and goblins. They pull Gandalf off the roof of Orthanc after Esat Ruman traps him there. They're the ones who eventually fly into Mordor itself to pull Frodo and Sam off the side of an erupting volcano after the ring's finally destroyed. None of this is ever explained on the page as Manwë personally intervening. Nobody in the story stops to say so. Gandalf certainly doesn't announce it. But once you know whose birds these actually are, it's very hard to read those scenes as pure coincidence anymore. It reads instead like a king who's promised not to interfere directly, finding the one loophole his original promise never quite covered. Birds were always allowed to fly where they liked. That same quiet hand shows up in a much bigger way if you think about how the whole story of the One Ring actually plays out. There's a recurring suggestion, mostly carried in things Gandalf himself says, that finding the ring at all, Bilbo stumbling across it underground in the dark, of all the places and people it could have ended up with, wasn't simply chance. Some force operating well outside the obvious chain of cause and effect seems to have been quietly steering events the whole time, nudging the right hobbit toward the right tunnel at exactly the right moment, centuries after Sauron lost it in the first place. Tolkien himself, in letters he wrote later explaining his own books, was fairly open that this was meant to be read as Iru's own continuing involvement. Working through means far too subtle for anyone inside the story to ever properly notice or prove. I think that's actually a properly elegant way to handle a god who's mostly absent for the entire third act of his own mythology. Rather than having Iru, or even the Valar themselves, show up and solve Sauron the way they eventually marched in and solved Morgoth, the whole resolution of The Lord of the Rings runs on something far quieter. Pity, extended at exactly the wrong moment, by exactly the wrong creature. The same pity Gandalf himself learned from Nienna centuries earlier, not the mercy of Eönwë, who did not spare the sons of Feanor after the War of Wrath. Gollum, of all people, ends up being the one who actually destroys the ring, purely by being spared when destroying him would have been so much easier and so much more understandable. None of the actual gods we've spent tonight talking about lift a finger to make that happen directly. They've simply built a world generations earlier where that kind of mercy was taught, was modelled, was passed quietly from one figure to the next until it landed, almost by accident, in exactly the place it needed to be. It's the sort of thing that only really clicks once you've sat through the whole backstory the way we have tonight. And I think it's honestly one of the better arguments for why bothering with all this older, denser material pays off. The films are wonderful on their own terms, properly wonderful. I'm not knocking them. But they're standing on top of an enormous amount of careful, deliberate architecture that never makes it onto the screen. And once you've seen the architecture, certain moments hit rather differently than they did before. Right, since we're already deep into the stuff that never quite gets resolved, let's talk about the one figure who genuinely doesn't fit anywhere in everything we've covered tonight. Despite an awful lot of very dedicated readers trying to force him into a tidy box for the better part of 70 years. Tom Bombadil turns up fairly early in the Fellowship of the Ring, living in a little patch of woodland near the Old Forest with his wife, Goldberry, who he describes rather sweetly as the daughter of the river itself, completely unbothered by basically everything, including, famously, the One Ring itself. Frodo hands it to him, at one point, at Tom's own request, and Bombadil just puts it on, makes himself briefly invisible, hands it straight back without the faintest flicker of temptation, which is, frankly, mad. Considering this is the same object that eventually corrupts kings, breaks the will of wizards, and reduces a perfectly ordinary hobbit called Smee-Gull into Goll, over the course of a few centuries. Given everything we've spent tonight on, Valar and Maya and the whole tidy structure of who serves whom, you'd think Bombadil would slot neatly in somewhere. He doesn't. Tolkien himself, in letters written to readers who asked him directly what Bombadil actually was, gave answers that don't really agree with each other from one letter to the next. At one point, he describes him as a kind of embodiment of the spirit of the actual countryside, something almost too old and too rooted in the land itself to be classified using the same categories as Valar or Maya at all. Elsewhere, he leans toward him being some sort of nature spirit, deliberately left undefined on purpose, specifically because Tolkien wanted at least one thing in the whole of Middle-earth that resisted being fully explained. My own honest opinion, for what it's worth, is that I rather love that he never properly answered it. Everything else tonight, every single Valar and Maya, fits into this enormous, carefully organised family tree. Married pairs, siblings, servants attached to specific lords, every relationship accounted for somewhere in the text. And then there's just Bombadil, sitting in his little house, singing nonsense songs, completely outside the entire system, immune to the single most dangerous object in the whole story for reasons nobody, including the man who invented him, ever fully nailed down. Some mysteries are more interesting left exactly where they are. I think this is one of them. Now, since we've spent the whole night building up to the world most people actually recognise, the one with hobbits and rings and a wizard who turns up uninvited at birthday parties, it feels right to close that particular loop properly before we drift off into the smaller, looser bits. By the time you reach the very end of The Lord of the Rings, after Ron's been defeated and the ring's gone, there's a quiet, genuinely moving scene at the Grey Havens where a handful of characters simply leave Middle-earth for good, sailing west across the sea. Gandalf goes, Bilbo goes, ancient by this point, worn thin by carrying the ring for so many years even before Frodo ever took it on. And Frodo himself goes too, never quite able to heal properly from everything the journey cost him, granted passage as a kind of mercy extended to ring-bearers specifically. Given everything we've covered tonight, that scene means rather more than it might on a first read. They're not just sailing off into some vague, symbolic sunset. They're heading for the Undying Lands, for Val-Inor itself, the actual home of the Valar, taken out of the ordinary physical world back when no men or sank beneath the waves. For Frodo and Bilbo specifically, mortal hobbits being granted entry to a place mortals were never meant to reach at all. It's about as direct a gesture of mercy as the Valar make in the entire span of the Third Age, even though, true to form by this point, they never show up in person to actually grant it. Gandalf simply arranges it, on their behalf, the way he's arranged most things throughout the whole story, quietly, from just slightly outside the frame. There's one last loose thread worth knowing about, even though Tolkien himself never properly finished it. Scattered through some of his later, unpublished writings is the idea of something called the Dagor Dagarath, a final battle right at the very end of time itself, when Morgoth is said to break back through the door. Of night he was cast through, after the War of Wrath, and the Valar, alongside resurrected heroes from earlier ages, fight one truly last war to finish what the War of Wrath never quite managed to finish for good. It's got fairly obvious echoes of Ragnarok, if you know any Norse mythology, which makes sense, since Tolkien drew on it fairly heavily throughout this whole cosmology. Eagles and a king on a mountain and all the rest of it. But he never settled on a final version, dropped it from his later thinking more than once, picked it back up again in other drafts. So it sits there, unresolved, a story Tolkien himself apparently couldn't decide whether he actually wanted to tell. I rather like that too, honestly. Not every door in a mythology this size needs to be properly closed. Here's a thing I find genuinely fascinating, and it's less about the mythology itself and more about the man who actually wrote it down. Tolkien was a devout Catholic his whole life. Properly devout, not in some loose cultural sense, and he was famously cautious about how readers might end up treating his own invented mythology. He wrote in a letter to a friend who'd asked him to clarify the whole cosmology that the Valar were meant to function more like angels than like gods in the pagan sense, intermediaries doing the work of a single creator rather than independent divine figures worth actually praying to in their own right. And yet, reading the books themselves, it's genuinely hard not to notice that the Valar behave an awful lot like a proper pantheon. Distinct personalities, squabbles, favourites, a king and queen presiding over the rest of them from a mountain. Scholars have pointed this exact tension out for decades, the gap between what Tolkien insisted the Valar were meant to represent and how they actually read on the page. There's a scholarly observation I rather like on this point, the idea that the moment the elves are gathered up and brought to live in Valinor, essentially under the protective wing of the Valar, it already edges uncomfortably close to worship, even though nobody in the story would have called it that at the time. Bringing your children to live literally at your knee, as one writer put it, is the kind of relationship that tends to slide into reverence, whether anyone intends it to or not. And once men later enter the picture, sometimes regarding the Valar as gods, the Valar themselves are shown as powerful angelic beings who are not meant to be worshipped at all. I think that discomfort is actually one of the more honest choices in the whole mythology. It would have been easy enough for Tolkien to simply let the Valar be straightforward gods, accept the worship, lean into the pantheon framing wholesale. Instead he kept building in this awkward seam, beings of real, immense power, who keep insisting, not always convincingly, that they're just middle management, simply doing a job Eru assigned them, not actually owed anything close to devotion. It gives the whole cosmology a slightly more human texture than you'd expect from something this cosmic in scale. Even gods in this universe seem a bit embarrassed about being treated like gods. Right, a few smaller, looser bits before we start winding down properly. Things that don't really need a whole section to themselves, but are worth knowing regardless. If any of tonight's structure felt vaguely familiar even before I mentioned it, that's not an accident. Tolkien drew fairly openly on Norse mythology while building all this, and the parallels are genuinely fun to spot once you know to look. Manwë, the wise king ruling from a mountain hall, presiding over a council of powerful beings, maps quite directly onto Odin and the Aesir gathering in Asgard. The whole idea of a final prophesied battle at the end of time, which we just touched on with the Dagor Dagorath, echoes Ragnarok almost exactly, right down to old enemies breaking free for one last confrontation. There's even a faint echo of wolves chasing the sun and moon across the sky in Norse myth, sitting somewhere behind Tilian's odd, wandering course past Arien that we mentioned earlier. He wasn't copying it wholesale, obviously. He built something properly, his own out of it, but the bones underneath are recognisably borrowed, and I think that's worth saying plainly, rather than pretending this all sprang from nowhere. We mentioned earlier in the night that, apart from Orome, none of the Valar's true private names were ever actually recorded anywhere in the texts, just titles. Worth a quick nod back to that before we close out, because it's part of why the Valar still feel properly mysterious even after a whole night spent going through every single one of them by name. And here's the last loose thread I'll leave you with. By the time you actually reach the events of The Lord of the Rings, centuries and centuries after everything we've talked about tonight, most ordinary people in Middle-earth have basically forgotten the Valar exist at all, beyond maybe a half-remembered story or two. Even Frodo, walking toward Mount Doom carrying the most dangerous object in the world, never once thinks to invoke them directly the way the old Númenóreans or the elves of an earlier age might have done. The gods are still there, technically, still real, still occasionally bending the world in small unannounced ways through eagles and lucky timing and a hobbit finding exactly the right tunnel. They've just become something closer to background radiation by that point, felt occasionally by the people paying close enough attention, mostly just quietly, permanently in the past. Quick one before we get properly toward winding down, because we left a loose thread dangling earlier, and I don't like leaving things dangling for too long. Remember the Silmarils, the 3 jewels Fëanor crafted, the ones holding the last captured light of the 2 trees, the ones Melkor stole on his way out of Valinor, setting off basically every tragedy in the rest of the Silmarillion. By the time the War of Wrath finally wraps up, all 3 have ended up scattered, and each one meets a genuinely different fate, which I think makes for a rather nice little closing shape to that whole story. One of them, recovered from Morgoth's Iron Crown during the final battle, ends up with Eärendil, the same mariner who sailed to Val Inor and pleaded for help in the first place. He wears it bound to his brow as he sails, and the Valar eventually set both him and his ship in the sky permanently, light shining out across the heavens. So if you've ever looked up and heard someone mention the evening star or the morning star, that's technically meant to be him, still sailing, jewel and all, somewhere up there above everyone's heads. The other 2 end up with Fëanor's surviving sons, Maedhros and MacLeod, who, having sworn an old, binding oath to recover the jewels, no matter the cost, steal them back near the very end of the war, despite Eärendil's mercy toward them, which we mentioned earlier. But the jewels themselves had been touched by Morgoth, tainted somehow by everything that had happened to them, and both brothers find their stolen Silmarils burn their hands the moment they actually hold them. An old oath finally collecting on a debt neither of them can pay anymore. Maedhros in despair throws himself and his jewel into a fiery chasm in the earth. MacLeod, unable to bear the pain or the guilt either, casts his into the sea instead, and is said to wander the shores singing ever since, grieving, never quite able to put it down properly, even with the jewel gone. So that's where they end up. One in the sky, one in the earth, one in the sea, every corner of the world holding a trace of the light of those 2 trees that died so long ago, scattered there by grief as much as by accident. Since we've just been talking about objects with a habit of causing trouble, here's a small bit of Third Age politics that ties a few of tonight's threads together rather neatly, and it involves the same wizards we just spent a whole section on. Centuries after the Istari first arrive, with Elrond rebuilding strength in a ruined fortress called Dol Guldur, Gandalf and several others form what's called the White Council, a group of the wisest figures in Middle-earth, Elrond and Galadriel among them, gathered specifically to keep an eye on the growing darkness and decide what, if anything, to do about it. Esharch-Rû-Mahân, as the most senior of the Istari, takes the lead of this council, which seems sensible enough on paper. What almost nobody else on the council realises, though, is that Esharch-Rû-Mahân has his own private reasons for steering things rather more cautiously than they should be steered. He's already begun studying the lore of the Rings of Power in secret, already growing curious about what it might mean to actually possess one, rather than simply guard against them. And a council that moves too quickly against SOW-Ron is a council that might stumble onto the One Ring before Esharch-Rû-Mahân's had a proper chance to find it for himself. So for years, he repeatedly talks the others out of attacking Dol Guldur outright, always with some reasonable-sounding argument about patience, about not provoking Eso-Ron prematurely, when the actual motive underneath is considerably less noble. It's a genuinely good bit of slow burn corruption if you trace it all the way through, because nobody on that council, not Gandalf, not Galadriel, properly suspects what's happening until it's almost too late. The same wizard sent specifically to inspire resistance against SOW Ron ends up, quietly and for years, being the single biggest reason that resistance doesn't actually happen any sooner than it does. Which I think says something fairly honest about how corruption tends to work generally, not as one dramatic villain turn, but as a long, patient pattern of perfectly reasonable sounding advice, each piece of it just slightly self-serving, until one day the whole council looks up and realises they've been led somewhere they never meant to go. Right, I said earlier I wasn't going to properly get into Beren and Luthien tonight, and I'm going to keep that promise, because it genuinely deserves its own night rather than a rushed summary tacked on here. But there's one detail about that story I do want to leave you with before we close, and it's not even fiction. It's about Tolkien himself. His wife, Edith, was the inspiration behind Luthien. By his own account, the woman he watched dance once in a woodland clearing early in their relationship, an image he apparently never stopped carrying with him. When she died, he had her gravestone engraved with the name Luthien beneath her own, and when he died 2 years later, he was buried beside her, with the name Beren added beneath his. I find that genuinely lovely, honestly, more than almost anything actually written in the books themselves. An entire mythology, an entire pantheon, a war that reshaped a continent, jewels scattered across sky and sea and earth, and at the very root of one of its most famous love stories is just a man who loved his wife enough to write her into eternity, then quietly arranged to lie beside her, under exactly the names he'd given them both. Quick callback to the 2 trees from earlier, because there's a detail I left out at the time on purpose, since it fits rather better here, right before we properly settle in for the night ourselves. Once the sun and moon are up and running, guided by Aryan and Tilion, Varda's original plan was for both of them to be in the sky together on opposing paths, mingling their light the way the 2 trees themselves used to, brightness layered on brightness, with only brief stretches of proper darkness built into the schedule. And it's Irmo and Esther, the Dream Master and the healer we spent time with earlier, who actually object to this plan once they see what it's doing. Their gardens start to wither under all that constant light. The stars get drowned out and lost behind it. And worst of all, from Esther's particular point of view, restful sleep becomes properly difficult to come by anywhere in the world, since there's never quite enough darkness for it to settle in properly. So they appeal to Varda directly, and she establishes the courses of the sun and moon, so they properly take turns instead, one resting in the outer ocean, while the other crosses the sky, giving the world a new stable rhythm of day and night, which means, when you trace it all the way back, the entire concept of a proper night's sleep, dark enough, quiet enough, undisturbed by competing light, exists in this mythology because the literal god of rest filed a complaint about her gardens dying. I rather love that. Felt like the right detail to leave you with, given what tonight's actually for. One more small bit of Maya lore, since we only really gave Ossu a single sentence earlier, and he deserves a touch more than that. Osa, you'll remember, serves Ulmo, drawn to storms and rough water near the coastlines, rather than the calmer deep ocean his lord generally prefers. Early on, during all that reshaping of the young world we talked about right at the start, Melkor approached him directly, flattering him, offering him dominion over whatever coastlines and shallow seas he liked if he'd simply throw in with him, instead of staying loyal to Ulmo. And Ossa, for a while, genuinely considered it, drawn in by the promise of having something properly his own, to rule, rather than always serving underneath someone else. It's his wife, Uinen, who talks him back from it before anything's properly done, and Ulmo himself, rather than punishing him harshly for even flirting with the idea, simply takes him back, trusting him with his old duties again, as though nothing had happened. I think it's a nice small counterweight to everything else tonight involving betrayal and corruption, Because here's one that almost happens and simply doesn't. Not through some grand battle or binding chain. Just a wife talking sense into her husband before he does something he can't take back. Not every temptation in this mythology ends in tragedy. Some of them just quietly don't happen. We touched on this briefly earlier, when we mentioned that men, unlike elves, don't end up in the halls of Mandos when they die. Their fate taking them properly outside the world entirely, rather than lingering anywhere within it. I want to sit with that idea a little longer now, because I think it's actually one of the more quietly devastating pieces of the whole cosmology, and it threads its way through nearly everything we've covered tonight, without ever being stated outright until now. Death, for men in this mythology, is called a gift. Tolkien is fairly explicit about that framing in his own writing. The idea is that mortality isn't a punishment or an oversight. It's something deliberately given to men that the elves themselves, bound to the world for as long as the world itself lasts, don't actually have, and in certain odd sideways moments are written as envying rather more than you'd expect. Being tied to a story forever, watching everyone and everything you love eventually fade while you yourself never get to leave, has its own particular weight that immortality doesn't obviously solve just by being immortality. And yet barely anyone in the actual story experiences it as a gift, which is rather the tragic irony sitting underneath the whole thing. We watched it play out properly earlier tonight with Enu men, or an entire civilization of men, granted longer lives than anyone else of their kind had ever had, growing more resentful of their own mortality with every passing generation, rather than less, until that resentment curdles into the worst act of arrogance in the entire mythology, an actual armed fleet sailing toward the gods themselves to take immortality by force. The thing they were given as a gift is the exact thing they end up destroying themselves, trying to refuse. I think that's a properly honest piece of writing, the kind you don't often get away with in stories this mythic in scale. Most fantasy worlds that bother with gods and elves and immortal realms tend to treat endless life as the obvious prize and death as the obvious tragedy. Tolkien just quietly flips that assumption underneath the reader's feet and lets an entire kingdom drown because they never managed to actually believe him. We mentioned the Ents briefly earlier when we talked about Yavanna getting anxious about the future of her forests and Eru answering that worry by giving the trees their own shepherds. I think they deserve a proper return visit before we close out tonight, partly because their own story carries one of the saddest unresolved threads in the whole mythology, and it's not really about gods at all by this point. It's about something the gods set in motion and then simply lost track of. Ents are slow, ancient, tree-like beings, given awareness and voice specifically to look after the forests, and the most famous of them, Treebeard, turns up properly in The Lord of the Rings itself, talking in a voice so unhurried it makes everything else in that story sound rushed by comparison. What a lot of casual readers don't necessarily pick up on, though, is that there used to be Entwives as well, a separate, equally ancient population who preferred open, cultivated land, gardens and orchards, rather than the deep wild forests their husbands loved. At some point long before the events of The Lord of the Rings, the two groups simply drifted apart, the Entwives moving off to tend their own gardens further away. And then, during one of the great wars of the Second Age, those gardens were destroyed entirely, the land turned to wasteland in the fighting, and the Entwives were never found again. Not killed as far as anyone in the story actually knows, simply gone, lost somewhere. Possibly still alive and tending some garden nobody's stumbled across yet. Possibly not. Treebeard himself, by the time Merry and Pippin meet him, has been searching on and off for centuries with no real success. And there's a genuine, unresolved sadness running underneath every conversation he has about it. An entire species slowly fading out, not through conquest or corruption, but simply through separation and bad luck. Nobody quite sure where to even start looking anymore. It's one of the few threads in the whole legendarium that Tolkien properly left open on purpose, and I think it's one of the gentlest, saddest bits of the whole mythology, oddly fitting for tonight. One last small detail before we properly settle into closing things out, since it ties back nicely to that point we made earlier about none of the Valar's true names ever being recorded. Different peoples across Middle-earth end up calling the same beings by entirely different names, depending on who's doing the naming. The dwarves, who owe their entire existence to Auli, call him Mahal rather than using the elvish name at all, a name that's properly theirs, passed down from their own first fathers. The men of Rohan, far later in the story, know Orome not by his Quenya or Sindarin names at all, but as Baima, a name that's drifted and changed shape across however many centuries separate them from anyone who actually knew him directly. Varda becomes Elbereth among the elves of Middle-earth specifically, distinct from her Valinorian name entirely, even though it's the exact same being either way. I rather like that detail, the idea that a single figure can exist simultaneously under 3 or 4 completely different names, depending purely on which corner of the map you happen to be standing in when you ask about them, with nobody anywhere actually possessing the original private name underneath all of it. It's the kind of thing that only really works in a story this old and this geographically scattered, every culture inheriting its own slightly warped, slightly personal version of the same distant truth. None of them wrong exactly, none of them complete either. One last proper topic before we drift into the smaller stuff, because we've spent the whole night talking about these beings as though they simply look like tall, good-looking men and women standing around in robes, and that's worth unpacking a little, since it's not quite that simple. None of the Valar actually have bodies of their own. Not originally. They're spirits, the same as the Ainur they started out as, and the forms they walk around in, eagle-winged Manwë on his mountain, Yavanna in her green dress, all of it are clothes they choose to wear, the way a person might put on an outfit suited to the occasion. They can change shape, drop the form entirely, or simply choose not to be seen at all, and the form they pick tends to say something about how they want to be understood by whoever's looking. Yavanna wears the shape of a woman, because growth and nurture read clearly in that shape. Tulkas wears the shape of a powerful, ruddy-faced wrestler, because that's the most honest version of what he actually is. Melkor's the interesting exception, and I think it's one of the better small details in the whole mythology. Early on, he could apparently take on forms of real, commanding beauty when it suited him, and he manages to talk his way back into Valinor's good graces after his long imprisonment by abasing himself and suing for pardon before Manwë. But the more evil he commits, the less control he has over that choice. By the time he's destroyed the 2 trees and fled to Middle-earth for good, he's stuck permanently in a single, dark, scarred, increasingly monstrous shape, unable to put on anything fairer ever again, even if he wanted to. His own cruelty becomes a kind of cage. The form simply stops being a costume and turns into the truth. It's a fairly elegant bit of internal logic for a writer to build into a mythology this size. The idea that evil doesn't just corrupt what you do, it eventually corrupts your ability to disguise what you've become. The Valar who stay good keep their flexibility, their choice of how to appear. The one who didn't loses his, slowly, with every act, until there's nothing left to hide behind anymore. There's one last thread I want to tie off properly, because it connects something from much earlier tonight, straight through to a place a lot of you will actually recognise from the films. Remember Lothlorien, the golden forest the Fellowship passes through, partway through their journey, with Gu, Ella, Driel and Kelle born ruling over it. The trees with that soft silver bark, and the leaves that never quite seem to fall. It's one of the more peaceful stretches of the whole story, almost suspended outside the danger building everywhere else. And that's not an accident either, not in the way it might first seem. Gu la Driel herself, long before any of that, came originally from Valinor. one of the Noldrin elves who left across the sea during everything that happened with Feanor and the Silmarils, before eventually settling in Middle-earth for the rest of the Second and Third Ages. And when she and Kel A. Born eventually shape their own realm, they name it Lorien, deliberately, after the actual gardens of Yermo and Esther we spent time with much earlier tonight. The place of rest and dreams, in Valar nor itself. It's not just a borrowed name either. By every account, Gu Eladriel is consciously trying to recreate that same feeling of suspended peace, working from memory, building something here in Middle-earth that echoes a home she can't physically return to. I think that's a properly lovely thing to notice once you know it. That the one place in the whole of The Lord of the Rings where the Fellowship actually gets to rest properly, where Frodo's wounds ease a little, and the weight of everything lifts even briefly, was built by someone deliberately copying the architecture of a goddess of rest she once knew. The pattern just keeps repeating, doesn't it? Mercy taught by Nienna, passed down to Gandalf, and deeply impressed upon Frodo. Rest designed by Irmo and Esther, remembered by Gu Eladriel, rebuilt for a company of travellers who have no idea any of it traces back that far. None of the actual gods show up to grant it. They just left enough of an impression that someone, generations later, knew exactly what peace was supposed to feel like, and built it again with her own hands. And that's probably a good place to leave things for tonight. We've covered the music that started everything. 14 gods and their gardens and their grief. A smith who got a bit ahead of himself. 2 trees, a long fall, and an even longer war. And where wizards like Gandalf actually come from before they ever wander into a hobbit's birthday party. There's loads more I haven't touched. The full story of Beren and Luthien, the fall of Gondolin, the whole tangled history of how Eoron forged the rings of power in the first place. Maybe another night, if you fancy it. What I keep coming back to, even after going through all of them properly, one at a time, is how little any of it actually needed to be this thoughtful. Most invented pantheons in fantasy stay fairly flat. A god of war, a god of the sea, job done. This lot get gardens, grief, jealousy, a marriage between a smith and someone who's terrified of what he'll do to her forests. It's a properly strange thing to have built, almost as an afterthought. Just to give one war in one book somewhere to actually come from. For now though, if you're still awake, that's on you. I did warn you at the start this wasn't built to keep anyone's attention. Sleep well, and I'll see you in which